Some of you I know in this room may be already familiar with MARVLIS because either you use it or some of your neighbors might use it. In talking with Chief Muncie earlier today, he told me about his vision for this conference, was really talking about the future. So I'm not going to talk just about what we do already with the software. I want to talk about where we could be going, where we should be going. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are heresy. But if you'll bear with me and think through some of the possibilities of the things that I'm about to say, some may actually apply and you may be able to use those. When we talk about resource management, and that's what BCS does, we're all about how we manage resources better. It's really about getting the right resources in the right place. But when we add the term tactical in front of that, it's about getting the right resources in the right place at the right time. So it's always in a changing environment. So you think about playing a game of checkers. You know, we always have to be thinking through and changing as we work through this process. I have 3 steps that I want to go through. I call it make a plan, make a decision, make a difference. But in listening to Jack this morning, I heard him say the same thing, was geo-decision, decide, and action. And it's really the same ideas. So real quickly, about making a plan, we look at history to give us an idea of what the future is going to be like. And we look at our historic call volumes, we can see this is 35 years of NFPA data. If you go back through your own data and look at that, you can project how many calls you're likely to see in 2018 or in 2019 within a pretty good level of confidence. But what is often hidden in that is the variation in that data. So whether you work 24-hour shifts or 12-hour shifts, we tend to resource our stations fairly consistently. But what we find is that demands for services are not consistent. They're skewed. They're skewed by time of day. They're skewed by day of the week, weekdays, weekends. And there are times when the demand outstrips our resources, but there are other times when we have resources available. So what tactical resource management is really about trying to match all of that demand and address it as quickly as possible or efficiently as possible. Again, historically, we look back at historic call data to be able to project forward. Jack Stout was doing this in EMS, and a lot of our experience is in the EMS market, but we have actually a fairly large concentration of our fire customers are actually here in California. But when we look at historic data to try to use that to look forward, that works well when we have the call volume to be able to do that. But in areas where we don't have that call volume, that becomes a little tougher. Real quick, this is a study I was involved in a county in Maryland, and they were looking at specifically possibly putting in a new station as opposed to renovating an existing station. So I ran through all of the statistics about call volumes and response times and all that, and everything came up saying that new station made no sense at all. And I didn't understand why they were even asking about that. And I said, why are you doing this? And they said, oh, because we're expecting a lot of growth in that area. History isn't that great of a planning tool then if we're looking at those sorts of significant changes. There are some ways to actually use GIS to help us do that. Esri's got some really cool tools called the Business Analyst, and we can talk more about that. And if I had more time, I'd get into that right now. But being able to project into the future reliably, and not just guessing or looking at alternative futures. When we look at history to help us forecast demand, this is actually our output from the demand monitor. And what you're seeing right now is the hotspot in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's Mecklenburg County. About midnight on a Friday night. And what you're going to see as the frames click through is 2-hour increments from Friday night to Saturday night. And what you see there is some wild variation in that demand. So while demand levels may be projectable, they are skewed both in time as well as skewed in geography. And so what we're really looking at is how do we match up those differences in time and differences in geography to the resources that we have available. When I talk with fire services, one of the things I talk about a lot is risk. And this is getting beyond just forecasting demand, but where do we need to be? So when I ask about risk, standards of cover studies tell us that flood zones are high-risk areas, right? Well, they're high-risk areas as long as it's raining, but if we're in the middle of a drought, it's not really a high-risk area. There are a whole bunch of sensors out there. Jack was talking about IoT, the Internet of Things. One of those things out there are stream gauges that USGS monitors. So as we look at stream gauges, and as stream gauges increase, that can tell us that downstream, these flood zones are going to become higher risk areas conditionally. Same thing about schools. Our schools are traditionally high-risk areas. Standards of cover tell us that. But at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning or in the summer, they're not high-risk areas at that time. So risk is not only conditional, but temporal. So if we can model risk, much like we model demand, we can make better decisions about where to put resources. One of the biggest changes to risk is population. What you're seeing here is some cells growing in color, or changing in color in Washington, D.C. as we go through an early morning hours to the mid-afternoon hours. And you see that the cells are getting darker and darker. This is not exactly real time, but this is showing us what we can model as far as people movement. We all walk around with these GPS devices, and we can get anonymized cell phone information so that we can look at one of the biggest risk factors we have, or that we know about, and that is people. So as people are coming into areas, we can see to these half-mile square areas where people are likely to be. Add that into those other risk factors, and we can build a demand surface, or a surface that's not truly demand, but actually risk. So as we look to change where resources are, we can actually be looking at moving from low-risk areas to high-risk areas. One of the biggest heresies that you'll hear me talk about is first due areas. So this idea of who can be first to a call is a fairly simple analysis to be done in GIS. Do that drive time analysis. But what we find in reality is that most of us don't live in places that these drive times really make sense all times of the day, all days of the week. This sort of analysis worked great 35 years ago when traffic patterns weren't quite what they are today. This is a very simplified map, but let's say we have a couple of stations, we have a business district up to the northwest. What we're going to find is that even running red lights and sirens, we're going to run into resistance moving with traffic. We're going to move slower than we will be moving totally against traffic. So the first due area is actually shaped a little bit differently in the morning. In the afternoon, we find the exact opposite is true. So now as traffic is moving the other direction, we can move very quickly against traffic, and so those areas that we couldn't reach in the morning can now be reached much easier in the afternoon. Let's take that a step further. Let's say we're out of quarters answering a call. When we finish that call, and a second call comes in. So we're up in the northwest corner. The next call comes in just on the other side of the station. It's well within our first due area, but it may be because of traffic patterns and conditionally where I am, so temporal and conditional risk, shows me that maybe another unit can reach that call faster. One of the things we hear a lot about is Waze. Waze is really a neat idea, and there's a lot of valuable things that can come from Waze, but Waze is modeling personal vehicles. If we're delivering pizzas, Waze is awesome. When you're running red lights and sirens, Waze isn't modeling the way that we drive. And so what we do currently through our software is look at your AVL history. When you're running to calls, how fast can you go in this particular direction at this particular time of day, this day of the week, and actually model based on your fleet's driving history, not on how people are driving throughout the time. So with all that information, we need to really change the game. So as we look to making decisions, we're not living in a checkers world anymore. We're living more in a chess world. The game is a little more complicated, and so we need a methodology that's going to allow us to respond to change and think dynamically in our responses. That doesn't mean street corner posting for fire apparatus. Okay. When I look at station-based versus street corners, that's not a dichotomy between static and dynamic deployment. There's actually a whole spectrum in between there. While the EMS world does well with system status management or beyond that to true dynamic deployment, fire apparatus don't work in that same way. But that doesn't mean that we all have to sit in the station all at the same time. We can be doing closest vehicle dispatch just because apparatus are out answering calls. They're out going to training. They're driving past calls as they're coming in. Or let's take that a step further and look at move-ups. And do move-ups based on that risk, going from low-risk areas to high-risk areas. We're not filling holes simply because a hole exists in the number of resources we have, but we're looking at risk in enhancing demand analysis. This is actually through the deployment monitor. This is a brand new feature that we have in here specifically for doing move-ups or making recommendations for how to move resources. So what we're doing is looking within areas and looking at when resources drop below a certain level, and they highlight in yellow. So District 1 has reached a time limit where it is down an engine right now, one engine. District 11 and District 3 have actually been down a little bit longer. We can set time frames. They've not only been down a ladder each, but it's now making recommendations of where to go get those resources from a lower risk area to bring into a higher risk area. So it's really, again, about managing those resources and bringing them to the point where they can do the most good. So the end is that action, making a difference. So we have a dashboard that we call the PSAP monitor that is designed to allow us to look at all the calls, look at all the vehicles, and be able to drill down through that. So I'm actually drilling into the fire resources right now. I have 8 units available, one's on a call. And looking into the calls right now, it shows me by district how many calls I have. And then it's a little bit grayed out there, but I'm able to see here my 90th percentile response times by priority code. So for priority 1 calls, what's my 90th percentile today? What's my 90th percentile this week, this month? Constantly being updated for right now. And this is designed to work across a web interface, so on your smartphones, your tablets, your desktops, whoever has access to that. I actually wrote a whole book on this. This is Closest Vehicle Dispatch, along with Andy Smith, who some of you may know from Alameda. He was a division chief, retired now. The idea of our book was to try to help people look at new ways of recognizing patterns in requests for service, and then new ways to look at not just demand projections, but risk projections as well. Trying to think of new ways to look at this that can utilize existing tools, so we already have the tools to do this. Technology is not our problem. The problem tends to be in our lack of understanding of how to apply some of the technology or the problems that we really face. And that's why I was hoping throughout this brief talk here that you would open up your minds a little bit and think a little bit different ways. Again, I know that some of these ideas are heretical, but through this we think we can become more proactive in planning as opposed to simply being reactive in our responses. So we have several copies of this book available at our booth. If we happen to run out, it is, if you're an Amazon Prime user, you can download the Kindle version for free. But we'd love to give you a copy of that and talk to you more about what we're doing now, as well as what you could be doing in the future. Thank you.